Okay. So I want to sing a little prayer to start, okay? And it's just, a prayer is words, right? And words are thoughts. And thoughts have meaning. And you could say, and we're going to talk about that the Buddha's expertise is the mind, is thoughts. So we'll start discussing this. So this prayer has got, the first two lines are for anybody in the room who already identifies with being a Buddhist, you know, reminding you of your reliance on the Buddha and his teachings. And the second two lines can be for all of us. It's sort of like expressing an altruistic kind of purpose for our being here together, to listen to these ideas, these viewpoints coming from this person called Buddha about life, happiness, suffering, blah blah blah, you know. And the altruism part is to take some is to listen to it as practical, to listen to it for some tools, because it needs to be practical. The tools are to help us develop what for the Buddha, and I'll go and discuss this, our amazing potential, basically. Then so that, on the other hand, because we all live in this world together, we can be of benefit to others. At the very minimum, you know, be of benefit to others. Something like that. Okay? Sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog Sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho baru dagni kyab suchi dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog. Well, how to deal with problems, or how to see problems as good, is a very interesting approach. I mean, it's a very interesting idea, kind of intense, but it's very much a part of Buddhist practice. And it all comes down, of course, to this understanding of the mind. And this is kind of a massive point, because, I mean, we all talk about the mind, you know, and we can see there are lots of views on this earth about what the mind is and what its, well, you could argue what its potential is, you know, what is the potential of human beings. So the Buddha's got his own very particular, very specific viewpoints. And, of course, in the weekend we're going to be going into this in more detail. But it's so to understand any of the Buddhist ideas, you know, and Buddhism is sort of quite current. Lots of people read about Buddhism, think about Buddhism, hear about meditation, these things. It's really crucial to kind of get an idea of what he thinks the mind is. Because he uses, you know, Buddhist psychology uses words that we all know about. He doesn't talk about schizophrenia and paranoia and ADID and DD this and stress that and psycho this. I mean, they're our terms that we use in the modern world. But he uses the old-fashioned kind of words like love, compassion, kindness, anger, anxiety, depression, generosity, I mean, and jealousy. We know this stuff upside down and back to front, you know. That's the stuff of Buddhist psychology. But the Buddha's view of the mind and the Buddha's view of what the potential of the mind is, what we can do with the mind, is right, you could argue, really actually is radically different in many ways from how we think about it. So as I said, in the weekend we're going to go into this in more depth. But here, you know, we could go into, we could talk about, yeah, okay. So before we even go into what Buddha's saying about the potential, it's just interesting to hear how he talks technically about what the mind is, what is the substance of the mind. And, you know, and we'll just mention this in passing, we'll go into this in more depth later, but it's got a great implication for a person who labels himself a Buddhist, this understanding of the Buddha about what the mind is. And the key point about the Buddha and the view of the mind is he's not discussing the brain. Now, this is a bit of a shock to us because these words are absolutely synonymous as far as we're concerned in the modern world. And anybody who studies neuroscience or therapy or psychiatry or psychology, the fundamental given is we're discussing the brain, you know. But here, if you like, even before we go into, even if we didn't discuss the Buddha's view that the mind isn't the brain, which sort of sometimes throws us, what are we supposed to do with that? I mean, we don't really, it doesn't really matter because the Buddhist approach to understanding the mind is experiential. It's a question of understanding the actual cognitive process itself, not the physical. So, in fact, Buddhist psychology is kind of interesting. It comes from these amazing Indians. I mean, the Dalai Lama, I don't know, I read a couple of years ago, and it really struck me, you know. He said it was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago who were the ones who began this incredible investigation into the nature of self. So, you know, it was these... Now, of course, in our kind of Western culture, we know all about the Greeks and the Romans, especially these fancy guys, these Socrates people, and all these these philosophers and amazing thinkers of maybe 3,000 years ago. We know virtually nothing about India. It's just not our culture, you know. And if we do think about India, it's kind of weird what we know, you know. We think of ladies with red dots and naked statues, and I mean, kind of hear my point, you know. And even Buddhism sounds pretty kind of esoteric and cosmic to most of us. But what's fascinating, I mean, I think materialist scientists would be utterly interested in this view of what the mind is and how it functions, because they did astonishing work back then. But the interesting point is they're not discussing the brain. They're not discussing the workings of the brain. They're discussing the actual cognitive process of thoughts and feelings and emotions themselves. They're not discussing that level of physical. You know, it's kind of totally interesting. And I want to discuss the mind at that level. Because even if you never know where your brain is, you know you get angry, you know you get depressed, you know you feel love and compassion. You don't need to know which, I mean, I've never studied the brain. I've never studied the brain, but I don't think you necessarily have to in order to know that you can deal with a problem in a day, that you're feeling angry, you want to shout at your boyfriend, but you're working on yourself and you know that shouting will be a problem, so you give yourself a little talk and you don't shout. Now you don't need to know which part of your brain is working to be able to do that. And that's the level of practice in Buddhism. Being your own therapist is the way that Lama Yeshe puts it. So the expertise of the Buddha is in learning to get focus, coming from this remarkable Indians more than 3,000 years ago, and then to be your own therapist, be your own psychologist, do this inner work day to day of listening to, thinking about, unpacking and unraveling your own thoughts and feelings and emotions. That's what actually being a Buddhist is. Get past all the religious part, all the holy images, all the prayers, all the being a nun or a monk, which sounds like religion. It's got all the trappings of a religion, you know. But there are these fundamental differences, which I'll also talk about. So these Indians, these remarkable thinkers and genius thinkers back then, one of the key things that's so remarkable is they're the creators, the inventors, the discoverers of this remarkable technique that's broadly speaking known these days as mindfulness meditation, which we all know is quite popular and quite well known. And so this is one aspect of this technique. And it's an astonishing technique. It's this remarkable, disciplined, sophisticated psychological skill that these Indians invented, that's a central technique of Buddhism today, in an unbroken chain since back that time, that enables a person to get extraordinarily subtle, concentrated focus. So it's an enormous discipline. It's an amazing discipline, you know. And don't hear this in any religious way whatsoever. A communist could do this, you know. This is the point about one aspect of the Buddhist approach. It's this skill to focus the mind. And what these amazing Indians discovered, therefore, this remarkable ability to focus the mind and to access subtler levels of this cognitive process called the mind that we don't even posit as existing in our culture. It's not even part of our psychology or our neuroscience. And the simple reason being, these subtler levels of cognition that these amazing Indians and the Buddhists have found doesn't rely upon the brain. These levels don't rely upon a brain. And that, of course, is why we think it's so cosmic and mystical. Because a default belief we have is if it doesn't depend on the brain, it doesn't exist. So it's from that point of view, it's quite a radical different approach or different viewpoint. So, you know, in order to think about more deeply the Buddhist understandings, and of course if you read Buddhist books and you think about reincarnation and karma and all this stuff, then it helps to take on board as your working hypothesis this view of what the mind is, you know. And it's dealt with an immense depth in all the literature, you know. So that's up to individuals to whether they're interested or not. But the actual approach of using mindfulness, and that's just one aspect of being a Buddhist, a tiny aspect, but it's pointing to this remarkable technique that these Indians cultivated. So on the basis of their doing that, what they did was then literally map the mind. And again, I'm not discussing the brain. They map the cognitive process. And it's totally fascinating. I mean, it's highly complex. And you read it initially, and it's so intellectual, you can't comprehend it, you know, because it's so sophisticated. The workings of this cognitive process called our mind, but not the brain. The actual working of the conceptuality and the way the mind works at these subtle levels. It's totally interesting, really. So this is the Buddha's view of what the mind is. They're not discussing the brain. You ask one great yogi, a Buddhist yogi, a Tibetan yogi, you know, who's never thought of the brain, who's never heard of the brain, where their brain is. They wouldn't have a clue, but they know their mind intimately and well, and have radically learned to change it. So the Buddha's idea about the mind then being not physical, you know, don't hear that as cosmic in any way. As a result of, you know, this is the other point about the Buddha. Buddha was this guy who came out of this remarkable Indian tradition, who left here, was some prince or something, left home, joined this extraordinary tradition of these thinkers who left the home and went into the desert, or not the desert, the forest or whatever, and, you know, took teachings from these great the philosophers roaming India at the time, who are the experts at this level of understanding the mind, and he wanted to understand the nature of the universe. Why suffering? What happiness? What is it? What's going on? What's the point of the world? You know, what's the meaning of life, in other words? That was Buddha's interest. So he left home, joined all these amazing people, learned these skills, learned also the current philosophies about what the self is, and then he went off in his own direction. He diverged in his own direction. But the point about the Buddha is this. He's not a creator, and he doesn't posit a creator. There's no such concept in Buddhism as a creator. Now that is a shock and a surprise because, like I said, if you look at the trappings here, it looks and sounds like religion. And the default view we all have of a religion is you posit a creator. There's a person, and I'm not criticizing. I mean, I was a Catholic and I have great respect for my Catholic upbringing. But the whole concept of a creator is as a superior being who is the source of happiness, the source of suffering, the source of the universe, the source of the laws of morality and all the rest, with whom we develop this relationship, you know, but who basically is the boss, and whose job at a very simple level of talking is to punish and reward because they're the boss. Well, it's the same in my mother's household. She's the boss. And if mummy says don't do this and don't do that, we know it's because mummy said, and then there's going to be consequences. Well, that's very much the relationship we have with a creator to one degree or another, and very much the view we have about morality is that one, punishment and reward. Which is why as soon as we hear the word sin, we have all this guilt and neurosis, you know. And as soon as we hear about anger, you're a naughty person, you're angry, we think of it in those terms. Well, Buddhism doesn't use terms like that. They would have a term, for example, you know, some people sometimes in English translate the Buddhist term negative thought or negative action as a sin. But there's none of that connotation that we tend to have, let's say, when I was a Catholic. So the Buddha not being a creator is a really interesting point. Because whatever's called Buddhism, it's come from this fellow called Buddha. But if he's not a creator, well, you've got to ask the question, well, that's interesting. Where did he get this information from? It's very interesting. I mean, you've got to ask that question. It's a very logical question. It's very reasonable. Now, we know, if I were Einstein here, telling you about, let's say, relativity. Now, you know I did not have a vision of it. You know it's not revelation. You know I didn't have a dream about it. You hope I'm not speculating. Do you understand what I'm saying here? You know, it came from my own hard work, from my own observation, using my own mind. Now, don't we call that science? Well, that's Buddha. That's Buddha. So all the stuff that's called Buddhism, that's valid Buddhism, lots of people make up rubbish. And indeed, Buddha does talk about continuity of consciousness. We'll discuss this maybe. Certainly, reincarnation, karma. These are part of Buddha's own philosophical view about the universe. But remember, it does not come from on high. It comes from his own mind, his own observation. So, you know, and that's where you can't. The Buddhist view is you don't just blindly believe Buddha, and that would be the view if you're religious. Like when I was a Catholic. You don't go around, you know, checking up on whether God is right or wrong. That's extremely rude. God's the boss, you know. So naturally you have faith in God. And I'm not criticizing this view. I'm really not. But that is not the Buddhist view. So the appropriate approach to being a Buddhist, and this is the terms that I use, Buddhism is my working hypothesis. You know, I say it that way quite purposely. I never use the word I believe in karma, I believe in reincarnation, I believe in this and that. Because as soon as we say that, we become intellectually lazy, and then we sort of shop around. Oh, I don't like that, but I won't believe in that. Oh, I believe in that. I mean, but it's absurd, you know. I mean, I think, in my opinion. You don't say, oh, I believe in mathematics. Well, explain it to me, please. Oh, I don't know how it works, but I believe in it. What good is that? I'm happy you believe in it. It does work. But unless you know it, and this is a crucial point. So people who even talk about, oh, I believe in reincarnation. Well, how does it work, please? Oh, I don't know. What good is that? What's the point? There's no point at all. And that's very much the Buddhist approach. So, you know, if you're a full-on, you know, jumping in the deep end Buddhist, and I suppose I'm one of them, I chose to, you understand, I chose to take on Buddha's view as my view of the universe. So these years I'm attempting to study it, learn it, you know, utilise it. I have to speak about it and apply it in my daily life. That's what I do. It's my job, you know. I suppose if you say you're a mathematician, I'm presuming you're going to apply it. If you just say you believe in maths, you're ridiculous, you know. So is it not? So this is very much the approach. So then, okay, but it's my working hypothesis. Because as soon as you talk about what Buddha says is a past life, don't ask me. I'm not clairvoyant. I can't see a past life. But that doesn't mean I can't learn it. And all of Buddha's teachings will show us the way. So basically, like Einstein, he is presenting his findings about what the mind is, what is happiness, what is suffering, how the universe exists. And it's up to us very much what aspect of that we choose to take on board. You can be a 1% Buddhist because you are the boss, not Buddha. So here we're going to discuss the mind, and surely over the weekend we're going to go into more detail, you know, of the Buddha's philosophical view of the universe and what causes suffering and blah, 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 all the rest, you know. Are we communicating here? Okay, good. All right. So let's talk about the mind a bit, okay? Because the whole business of seeing problems as good or learning to love problems, or as Lama Zopa puts it, learning to love problems like we like ice cream, it comes down to the mind. It comes down to, and this is the crucial way of describing the workings of the mind in Buddhism, which is that what goes on in our mind is a bunch of thoughts, a bunch of viewpoints, a bunch of opinions, right? So, you know, so when you study Buddhist psychology, it's a really interesting example, okay? Let's say, you know, it's a bit of a boring example, but let's say I say to you, oh, what a pretty cup. And I kind of might, because the design, the shape, I rather like the shape. The colour's hardly fantastic, but you understand. But the shape's quite pleasing. So I might say to you, what a pretty cup. So naturally, all of us would assume, would we not, that that's an object of my eye consciousness, that my eyes are seeing a pretty cup. Well, when you study Buddhist psychology, you learn the epistemological model of the mind, which describes the way the mind works, which is, like I said before, is totally fascinating, quite extraordinary, but quite fascinating. Then the second one, is, of course, is the actual psychological model, which I want to talk about, the contents of our mind, or the neurotic parts of us, the positive parts of us, which is the real stuff, you know. But here, just for a second, let's look at this. It's a really powerful point, which is indicating the point I want to make. We would all assume my eyes are seeing a pretty cup. Well, Buddha says, don't be ridiculous. You know, the way they describe in the texts, these sensory consciousnesses, the word mind in Buddhism and the word consciousness are virtually synonymous, okay? But they're used in different contexts. So here we talk about the eye consciousness, ear consciousness, tactile consciousness. We understand. So this, speaking it very clearly, what Buddhism is describing is that part of my mind or my consciousness which necessarily isn't physical, that depends upon the eyeball, the eye, you know, all the nerves working nicely. So bringing all these components together, there will be a moment of cognition through my eye consciousness. Now the eye consciousness, though, the sensory consciousnesses for the Buddha, and this is the telling point, are like profoundly limited in their capacity for cognition. Eye consciousness can only cognize shape and colour. Ear consciousness, I'll hear one note of that trumpet and I'll go, wow, Miles Davis, you know. But my ear consciousness can only cognize sound. So the obvious question has to be, what part of my mind does what a pretty cup come from? So this is your mental consciousness, and that's Buddha's expertise. And as Lama Zopa puts it, that's where the workshop is. That's where all the thoughts, all the feelings, all the emotions, all the unconscious, all the subconscious, instinct, intuition, this entire spectrum of our inner being, which is the stuff of Buddhist psychology and the stuff of a Buddhist practitioner, it's all the happiness, the suffering, that's the mental consciousness. That's where the workshop is. And that's, like I'm saying, the stuff of a person who's studying Buddhist psychology and then obviously utilizing it to be their own therapist. To do the point of all of this, by the way, is to do the job that Buddha has found, that he said he accomplished, that we can all accomplish, which is to to develop the mind to this astonishing degree of clarity. He says our mind has this potential. The word Buddha, interestingly, the word Buddha is Sanskrit, but the Tibetan word Sangye, the etymology is very interesting. The first syllable, sang, implies the utter eradication from the mind of all neuroses, all ego, all fears, all depression, all jealousy, anger, low self-esteem, that stuff that we know so well. And this is a shocking statement to make, but this is the point, that Buddha, from his own direct experience, like Einstein, has found that this is possible, that he has said, he has accomplished this, and he presents his methodology of how to accomplish it. But not just that. We can do that, that's the first part of the job. And then the second part of the job is indicated by the second syllable, Ge, Buddha. And that is the development to perfection of all the goodness in us, the love, compassion, kindness, blah, 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 you know. So essentially what Buddha's findings finally are, which is the point of being a Buddhist in the long term, and is what the methodology is all about, is to accomplish this state of becoming a Buddha. There's more to it than that, but that's the essence of it, and it's all about understanding the mind. So the Buddha has found from his own experience that the mind has this marvelous potential to be free of all the neuroses, free of all the rubbish, and developed in all the goodness, speaking really simply. Now, that's a shocking concept. If one of you is a therapist, or indeed a neuroscientist, and I come to you and I would say, would you please give me methods to eradicate from my mind forever, permanently, all neurosis, all fear, all depression, all anger, all jealousy, all ego, and develop infinite love and infinite compassion all the time for all beings, you'll think I've got a serious problem. You understand my point? And I'm speaking simple words here, but that's the point. That's what Buddha's saying. So, of course, we read Buddhist teachings in nice 14th century Tibetan language and nice ancient 2,000-year-old Indian language, and you have pictures of nice holy Buddhas with yellow robes looking slow and being mindful, and so we stick it in the sky and we call it religion, you know, because this doesn't sound very viable. Not a possibility, like ridiculous. But this is the point. Buddha's not a creator. He's telling you what he's found from his own direct experience. And don't believe him, don't believe him. It's up to us to look into it, seeing if we think he's worthwhile, reasonable, and then you spend your time going into it and start applying these methods yourself, one step at a time, like you would with Einstein's findings about relativity. It's the same approach in Buddhism. Okay, drop a bit. So our mental consciousness, what the Buddha is saying essentially, and this is the stuff that's dealt with in massive depth in all the literature, is that all the stuff that goes on in our mind day to day, we're not discussing the senses, we're discussing the mental consciousness, it's all the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, all this stuff, that it all comes down to being a bunch of thoughts. Now, thoughts in Buddhist psychology, you know, go to incredibly subtle level. And when we've learned even to cultivate even low levels of this technique that's broadly known as mindfulness, but more precisely actually is called single-pointed concentration. It's described in terms of 9 stages of development, and when even by the 5th of those 9, and most of us in this life won't accomplish that, you've already gone beyond your grosser level of conceptuality, which we don't even posit as existing in our culture. So it's a very radically different view in many ways. So, but the workings of this mental consciousness, from the Buddha's point of view, that's our job. That's why you want to get some concentration. That's why you would, if you were a Buddhist, want to study a little bit the way the mind works, so you can start to identify in this kind of a big emotional soup in here what the hell is going on, you know. So we can start to unpack and unravel it, and then start to have incredible control over it, and not just control over it, but to radically change it. Because Buddha's key point, and again we can go into this in immense depth, and we won't here, is that there's all these neuroses, the anger, jealousy, depression, anxiety, arrogance, these simple words. We know that they're the source of the pain. We know, we see people fighting. It's not because they love each other. Why people kill, wars, dramas, maniacs, doing things. It ain't because of love and compassion and kindness, speaking in simple terms. It's the other stuff, the neuroses, and we all recognize them. So in our world, in our culture, we would just assume that they're normal. And what we mean by normal is that you'd be abnormal if you didn't have them. But this is Buddha's point. He's quite radical. He says we don't need them. He says in Buddhist psychology they use the term that these states of mind are adventitious. They're not at the core of our being. They're not integral to who we are. So that's why he has found that we can rid the mind of them. So it's a bit of a shocking concept if we take our views of the mind. That's why we've got to keep, you know. So the point is though here, therefore, if that's where we're heading slowly, then we need to comprehend what these states of mind are and what is it about them that's the problem. And then what is it about the positive states of mind? Not just in a superficial emotional way, oh yeah, being loving is better than being angry, but really going into depth with this stuff. That's what you're trying to do as a Buddhist, you know, if we're doing it halfway properly. So the Buddha's idea about all these emotions, this is what's fascinating. We'd call them emotions, right? Emotions for us, I think, when we use that term, it's only when we feel them physically that we think of them as a problem. Like that's why a person, let's say, who gets angry easily, it doesn't take too long to recognize they've got a problem. The words are shouting out the mouth, the eyes are wide, the tears are coming, irrational words are coming out of the, you know, it's fairly evident. But a person who gets depressed, let's say, you don't realize you're depressed until you can't get out of bed one morning because you're inert. But it's taken so much longer to recognize, and that's a really key point, because in Buddhist view, and we can see it's true, we're not aware of underneath of what's going on at a deeper level. And don't make it mystical by calling it unconscious. You know, we call it that, but it's just because we're not conscious, because we don't pay attention, because we don't have techniques to pay attention. And that's really this marvelous skill, this one called concentration meditation, used in what's called mindfulness meditation. It's a practical skill that enables us, if we practice it properly, to even minimally get to step out of your own head, step out of all the mess and focus the mind so that you can begin, and this is the real job, the job starts here, you can begin to hear all the crazy thoughts. Because anger is an emotion, yes, but it's underpinned by these conceptual stories, you know. Love even, too, compassion as well. They're underpinned by elaborate conceptual stories. But our problem is we only notice them, like I'm saying, when they're full-blown emotions, when the body's involved. Because we don't have skills in our culture, more and more these days, to pay attention at a deeper level. And don't hear this in any mystical way at all. It's not. It's a really full-on, intense, disciplined job to be done, you know. And the reason for Buddha to do this job of knowing your mind well, there's no religious reason for it, it's a practical reason, you know. So, you know, like if I've got who's my boyfriend? I don't know, what's your name? David. I forget, David. Have you been my boyfriend before? I use examples, my boyfriend. Let's say David's my boyfriend. So you see me angry. You'll say, what's wrong, Robina? And guaranteed I will give a detailed description of David's bad behaviour, won't I? Because my anger comes from David, doesn't it? This is such a default view in our world. We don't ever question it. You know, if I get jealous, what's your problem, Robina? I'll describe David's behaviour. If you're happy, what's happening, Robina? Why are you happy? I'll describe David's behaviour. I blame him for my happiness as well. So this is a default mode for us, isn't it? And this is very much, again, the view in our own materialist views. If I go to you as one of my therapists and I keep telling you about my crummy boyfriends and why I keep getting jealous or keep getting angry, what we're going to look at is we're going to look back into the past for a start, trying to look for a needle in a haystack, aren't we? For what started it? Where's the cause of why not just my anger and my jealousy, but why I choose crummy boyfriends, who we agree are the cause of my anger and my jealousy, because I've learned it back there somewhere. So there's nothing wrong with that. Buddha wouldn't argue. There's nothing wrong with looking in the past. Nothing wrong with looking in the external events. There's nothing wrong with understanding the body to see what the imbalance of the chemical, whatever, you know. Nothing wrong with that. But the Buddha's approach is way more direct. And often, initially, quite hard to hear initially. It sounds kind of peculiar. Buddha's basically saying, you're right. Well, I understand, Robina. David is, you know, he did that. He does look at the other people. Maybe we can even establish they are truths, that he did do those things. But basically Buddha says, that's his problem. Now let's look at yours, honey. And yours is called anger, and yours is called jealousy. So he's not saying that my mother's behaviour didn't affect me. He's not saying that David isn't cheating on me. He's not disagreeing with that. That isn't the issue. And that's why this is hard to hear, because as soon as we hear that the anger and jealousy are my problem, it sounds like Buddha's blaming me. You mean it's my fault? Because I think the way we analyse our problems, we're very much wanting to find something out there that kind of gets me off the hook. But it's not my fault, we will say. This is very instinctive. And Buddhist psychology is very fascinating in the way it describes that process, you know. The way ego works, the kind of irony of ego in Buddhism is it's sort of this dualistic, or Lama Yeshe would be very blunt sometimes and call it schizophrenic, way of desperately looking out there for the thing that caused the happiness and caused the suffering. Whereas the Buddhist approach is, those things do play a role. Of course they do. It's evident. We're very interdependent scenarios, you know. But his key point, and don't hear it as blaming, don't hear it as religion, it's practical. They have a saying in Buddhism, and this is the whole business about problems now, that if you can change something, hey honey, please change it. No one says you can't. But what if you can't? And that's where the work starts. So that's why I love to talk about people in prison, my friends in prison. I worked like 20 years ago, 22 years ago. Excuse me. The last 20 plus years, I was kind of based in America. Now I'm on the road a bit, but I'm originally from Australia. But I started, when I was editing a Buddhist magazine, Mandala, the magazine of the organisation that we're part of here, I got a letter from this young American guy from Los Angeles who was in this top security prison in California, where he'd been there since he told me he'd been in prison, gangs since he's 11, prison since he's 12, and then 3 life sentences since he was 16, you know, tried as an adult. The prison system in America is kind of fascinating. They say America has 5% of the world population, but it's got a 25% of the prison population, meaning a quarter of all humans on earth who live in prisons live in the United States. And they have 50% of all lawyers. I heard recently. They're in the right country, aren't they? God knows what's going to happen about prisons with Mr. Trump, isn't it? Can't bear to think about it. Anyway, the point is that then this guy wrote, he'd read a book by Lama Yeshe actually, and then he was really moved by the talk of compassion, and he wrote a letter to Mandala magazine. So I got the letter, I was the editor. And that started this project that became known as Liberation Prison Project. So I ran it for about 14, 15 years. It's still going now. I don't run it anymore. But I think over that period, we got letters I probably got letters from 25,000 people in prison. In America, some from Europe, not many, but mostly America and Australia. And so for me, it was a very moving experience, because if you want to talk about problems, these are the most perfect examples. You're living in these garbage dumps. You're treated like an animal. You are considered to be an animal. You've got these intensely long sentences. Many of these human beings have no chance of getting out alive, you know, many on death row. So for me, it was the most moving experience of really trying to see the practical application of this stuff that I'm trying to live, being a Buddhist, you know, especially of the one, they call it transforming problems into happiness. It's a whole approach, which we're actually very familiar with. We do this every day, actually. We're always dealing with problems and trying to find a better way to look at them. That's all it really is. But these friends in prison, their situation is kind of dire, because here are we always theoretically think we're free. We're in a lousy job. We always know theoretically we could leave the job. You're in a lousy relationship with a lousy boyfriend. You know you could leave. But if we analyse our lives, look how we might as well be in prison. We become completely paralysed. People go back like a moth to a flame to their crummy boyfriend until eventually, guess what? They get killed, you know. I mean, this is the suffering of the mind. There's another number I always like to quote. And this is as an ex-feminist or a present feminist. This is not against men. 40% of all women on earth who get murdered, you know who murders them, don't you? The bloke in the same bed. Well, it's kind of a stunning figure. And this is not about men or women. This is about the mind. How we have such ignorance about what the hell goes on in our own mind, our own feelings. We don't realise we have attachment and depression and anger. We don't realise we're blaming him completely for all the problems. He's not realising he's blaming me for all his problems. And then, of course, you live in the same bed every day. No wonder you're going to kill each other, you know? I mean, I'm not kidding. I mean, it's so intense. In the prisons where this young man, this Arturo, the type of prison situation he was in, it's shifted now. They were in their cells 23 hours a day, 2-man cells, right? And they kill each other regularly. Well, I mean, you would. Think of yourself in a small bathroom, a bit bigger than that one, enough for 2 bunks and a toilet. 23 hours a day, okay? Day in and day out, in your orange jumpsuit, 10 books you're allowed to have, no hardback because you can whack your cellmate. The inside of a pen, no hard one because you can stab your cellmate. You're not allowed to have a hot drink because you can tip it on them. So you drink, you know, Kool-Aid. You can't imagine the intensity of these insane environments, you know. They killed each other regularly. Well, put yourself there with your best friend in a small cell, 2.1 meters or something, or maybe, I forget, but very small. Of course you kill each other. You go completely insane. The noise, he described the noise like being in a rock concert all day. I mean, can you conceive of living like that, you know? So there are these people whom I have such admiration for, who took, like, you know, what do they say, ducks to water, to the Buddhist teachings. The idea of meditation, controlling your own mind. They just love, many of them really, really like this approach. Because what choice do you have? You know, what choice do you have? This is, at least you can see at the most practical level, that an offering from Buddhism, this marvelous ability to go inside in a practical way, not a cosmic way, so you can get some control over your crazy mind. If you can change the outside, if I can ask David to stop looking at other girls, aren't I lucky that he says, all right, I won't anymore, Robina, please forgive me, and he becomes a nice guy. Wow, life's good. But let's look how we can't change. So often can't change things. So even though we feel like we're free, the Buddha's idea is that we're completely paralyzed. Not as if he's forcing me to stay. Not that the boss is forcing me to stay in that job, but by our own neuroses, our own fears, our own insecurity, our own depression, our own anxiety, our own lack of self-confidence, which is the mind. You know, we don't know our own mind. We don't even think it's necessary. I mean, one time Lama Zopa said, and it sounds so shocking, most humans on this planet have no idea that what goes on in their mind plays any role at all in their lives. That sounds pretty stunning. But the more, you know, in my own opinion, you know, the bit trying to practice what I, you know, the stuff I'm doing, it becomes evident because we're so obsessively focused on the outside. Don't hear this as moralistic, please. It's a practical issue. So that's why I like the examples of my friends in prison who could not change anything. And that's why I love this one example I quote often. This one woman who was on death row in Florida. I didn't meet her. I read her memoir. But it was so moving, you know. She was hitching in Florida, it's like 30 plus years ago, with a hippie husband and hippie kids. They got picked up by two blokes. And then the cops stopped the blokes, and the guys killed the cops, and then blamed the hippies. Well, they're put on death row. Well, first of all, you're the worst person in the universe. You're a cop killer. You can't even conceive of the nightmare. I mean, look at when even someone accuses us of breaking a cup, and you didn't do it. It's like we go mad, you know. So here they are, accused of murdering two police. And the husband even got executed. You can't imagine the torture. And this woman, amazing woman, I have such respect, you know. And she said, at some point, I realized I couldn't change anything. But they couldn't take my mind from me. So she said, I decided, I'm not a monk, I'm not a prisoner, I'm a monk. I'm not in a cell, I'm in a cave. Now, right there is the essence of all the Buddhist teachings and all the Buddhist application and all the Buddhist ideas of practice, right there in that one statement. And this is the essence of the whole point of this discussion. The Buddhist view is when you really know your own mind well, and keep hearing this is not mystical, it's practical. When you're familiar with the way anger works, you listen to the cognitive process beneath the emotion of anger, jealousy, depression, attachment, anxiety, all the other stuff. Really become familiar, full on, focused, disciplined, not just meditating, but learning this model of the mind. They are the tools you need to slowly know with confidence that you can change these cognitive stories. But what did that woman do? Listen to that statement. Listen to that statement she made. Don't hear it as cosmic. She changed her thoughts. She changed her viewpoint about being in prison. And that's really the point that I'm making. All Buddha's saying is all the stuff in our mind are a bunch of viewpoints. And we can change them. It's up to us. But look how difficult. Because when I'm angry with David, nothing in the universe will tell me that I have any changing to do. It's his fault, we will say. We know this so well. Even if we're highly educated, intelligent, lovely, compassionate people, we all fall into this trap because this is the Buddhist view. This is the way these neuroses work. It's their function. They're like concrete, you know. It's the way ego works. We become incredibly concrete, incredibly fixed in our view about things. And then we can't see that it's our view. We are convinced that what I'm seeing is the objective truth. Now, the objective truth is he did cheat on me, but that's not what we're discussing. The objective truth, that woman was on death row. She couldn't change that, but she could change her viewpoint about it. And that is the way to say it. That's the essence of being a Buddhist. That's it. That's the essence of it, you know. Knowing that if she could have got out of prison, believe me, she would have got out. She, in fact, got out after 17 years. I was so happy for her, you know. But meanwhile, she became a sane, amazing, kind, wise, compassionate human being. You couldn't be more intelligent than that. But how incredible. And that's why I think extreme examples are good, you know. So don't wait till you're accused of murder before you start changing your mind, basically. You know, or before David kills me or I kill him. Yeah.
You talk about blame, you talk about guilt. Now there is a feeling that, for example, if we take Catholicism, if you hurt someone, but you feel true remorse.
That's right.
So what's the role of remorse?
I understand. No, a big one. It's a very interesting. Okay, it's an interesting point. It's like, you know, in my relationship. Let's say let's say the shoe's on the other foot, and I'm the mean person. Let's say I always badmouth David, you know, shout at him, abuse him, insult him. So you know, then I go to work and I feel bad. So there is remorse there. But much of it, if we're not looking carefully at our mind, a lot of it is guilt and I'm a bad person. But even more deep than that, there's the fear he will reject me. There's the fear he will stop loving me. So my own investment, ego investment in apologizing is often not so healthy. It's like I'll ring him up, or I'll go home and I'll look him in the eye and I'm afraid, oh, David, please forgive me, I'm so sorry. And I'll see him in the eye, he's looking at me and he says, all right, Robina, I still love you. Now that's really wonderful. But if I don't make a decision to go further and actually make an attempt to change and stop bad-mouthing him, then I'll just bad-mouth him again tomorrow, and at some point he won't forgive me anymore. So I think in our relationships, ordinary level, we can misuse the idea of, in other words, I'm almost like making him responsible to get me off the hook from feeling bad. A little bit, I'm saying it. So, but in general, the Buddhist approach, of course, it's not the same concept as the Catholic one. If I'm a Catholic, God is my creator. So I must confess to God and I must beg God to forgive me, wouldn't I? That's part of the process, isn't it? Is it not true? But the Buddhist one, Buddha would forgive me, he's a nice guy. But that's not his job. Do you understand my point? The Buddhist one is more internal. I can rely upon the Buddha. I would use Buddha's tools, if you like, to help me. But I'm the one who has to recognize I did something wrong. I'm the one who has to acknowledge, yes, I badmouthed David. Don't blame David. It's my own stupid mouth and my own anger. So taking responsibility for the Buddha is the first one. It's called regret, or if you like, remorse. But not to do with I'm a bad person. To do with, it's like compassion for yourself, because I've got to first recognize, the Buddha's view is very much, we'll go into this in more detail, I've got to first recognize that my anger hurts me. This is the first step in Buddhism. It's a very powerful point, not just for his sake, but I've got to first recognize that anger and jealousy and attachment and anxiety break my heart. So there's a nice analogy in Buddhism, this business I told before about the two aspects of Buddha. The first component of practice in Buddhism, they say a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So what I'm discussing right here is the wisdom wing. Is all this understanding my mind is for my sake. Understanding that anger and anxiety and depression aren't bad because I'll get punished, which is our usual view, which is why we have guilt, but they're bad because they hurt me. So it's like intelligence, it's like self-respect. That's very much the Buddhist attitude. So this attitude of regretting bad-mouthing my boyfriend has to first be talking to myself, I'm sick of this suffering, I'm fed up with this pattern, I'm fed up with getting angry, and I'm fed up with being angry, it's hurting me. We've got to have that, and that's got nothing to do with guilt. That's like a really intelligent view, and this takes quite a lot of time, because we always run to guilt. Oh, I'm a bad person. Do you understand my point? Yeah. So it's a very healthy one, and that's like compassion for yourself. Then I can have compassion for him. Then I can say, and I'm now really sorry, Dave, because I can see the suffering it's causing me, I'm sick of this pattern, and then I'll have compassion for him, and then I can genuinely apologize, and then the crucial point is I have to make a decision to change, for my sake as well as his. We call that process purification. Psychologically, they go into it in quite depth, but it's a really crucial point, this first point I'm making, about the Buddhist attitude to guilt. I think it's one of our worst crimes against ourselves because we make it so neurotic. we make it like I'm a bad person. It's like anger against, when we misuse it, it's like anger against ourselves. Oh, I did this, I did that, I'm a bad person. And I think our ego runs to that very naturally. And then we can get very depressed and we want to kill ourselves and not kill him instead, you know. Do you understand my point here? So healthy, I remember one time the Dalai Lama, because there is this, we'll discuss in the weekend, there's this practice, we call it purification. And it's this process, internal process of regretting your rubbish because you're sick of suffering, having compassion for the person you harm, doing a purification, and then making a decision to change. It's a very practical psychological process, right? So the Dalai Lama one time was asked, what's the difference between this first one, regret, and guilt? And it was very clear the way he said it. He said, guilt, you look in the past and you say, I did this and I did that and I did this and I'm a bad person. We recognize that, don't we? And then he says, but regret, this healthy one, you also look in the past and you say, I did do this and I did badmouth David. You own it. But then you say, what can I do to change? It's more optimistic. And it's based on more, it's not like self-hate, you know? I think that can be very tricky. And if you think about guilt, I'm a bad person. Listen to anger. You did this and you did that and you're a bad person. So really guilt, I think we could argue, is anger, but you're the object. And it's extremely unhealthy. It's terribly destructive. And we can confuse it with a healthy type of attitude of regretting something we've done wrong and then wanting to change, you know? Do you understand my point? It's quite tricky. Now we're talking about questions. Maybe more questions then. I mean, I've talked a little bit. I don't have enough food for thought yet. A whole hour. Okay, questions. I've just begun talking about the mind, okay? Few ideas about it. I haven't really gone into details of the contents yet, except a bit I said here. But are there any questions on what I've said so far?
Robina,
yeah, where are you?
Quick question about, we were talking about different emotions, but what about grief? How does what's the Buddhist view of
Let's unpack it, okay?
Yeah, because I have a friend who's really suffering from the loss of a
Yes,
partner. Like
absolutely. Okay, before we answer that, I think great. Before we answer that, let me just describe a little bit the the characteristics of these neurotic states of mind. Buddhism goes into this quite in depth, you know. So just casually talking, if we say love, compassion, generosity, forgiveness, we know they're the good stuff, don't we? We know if we're on the receiving end of those, it's nice, and we know if they're prevalent in our mind at any given point that they're nice. We know that without being a psychologist. If you say angry, depressed, anxious, jealous, paranoid, you know they're the miserable ones. Again, whether you're on the receiving end or whether you have them yourself. We know this stuff just automatically. So the Buddhist psychology deals in a very specific way with the contents of our mind, the stuff that we all think of as a big soup of emotion, and that we would tend to think, I would suggest, as I'm saying, the modern psychology would say are normal parts of a normal person. In other words, we give equal status to anger, jealousy, love, compassion. And we would obviously wish that you've got a reasonable balance of those and you'd be a reasonable human being. Well, like I'm suggesting, Buddha's view is kind of more radical. He says, hey, baby, you don't need any of the rubbish and you can get rid of it and you can develop the goodness to incredible degrees, which is kind of a shocking concept. And because we're so unfamiliar with that idea, we almost can't conceive of a person who has no anger, no jealousy, and only has love and compassion. That sounds like ridiculous. We're so not used to thinking this way, so we've got to really think of it carefully. So the key point I want to make here then, the Buddha's idea about the states of mind in us that are the ones that are the problem. Because as far as he's concerned, and this is where, again, in all the teachings, we're going to go to this on the weekend, where he goes into the more detail about what are the causes of suffering, right down to the nuts and bolts. What are the main causes of suffering? And Buddha's view would be, which initially is quite shocking, is these neurotic states of mind. Not David. He's one of the causes, but he ain't the main cause. The Buddha would say it's my neurotic states of mind. So then we have to understand this, we have to understand this clear distinction Buddhist psychology makes between what they simply refer to as negative states of mind and positive states of mind. So in the Buddhist model of the mind, when you look into the details of mental consciousness, we've got sensory consciousness and then we have mental consciousness. And like I said, that's where the workshop is. That's what we have to learn to understand. So mental consciousness, all the contents are divided in Buddhist psychology into three categories. There's no fourth category. And this is coming from these amazing Indians as well. There's those that are simply called negative, positive, and there's a third category called neutral, but not meaning that they're not important. So I like to call these the mechanics of the mind. So that, you know, we have a capacity of the mind called concentration, don't we? We have the ability to not forget what you're doing from moment to moment. We have an ability to pay attention. We have many of these, and these happen, by the way, to be really developed. We can really develop these to an incredible degree in this concentration meditation technique. They become very skilled. So these are the neutral ones insofar as they don't have the characteristics of a virtuous state of mind or a positive one like love and compassion. Because the key characteristic of the positive ones is they're reasonable, they're based in some sense of reality, and they're connected to others. When you've got more love and compassion, if I've got more love and compassion and kindness in my relationship with David, it's a no-brainer. We've obviously got a sense of connectedness, there's more harmony. Life is sweet. It's sort of obvious, you know. But if there's more anger and jealousy and anxiety, life is a nightmare. We kind of know that. There's a sense of separateness. David's way over there. He's the cause of all my problems. I'm over here feeling really neurotic. We can really see. So the Buddhist psychology goes into great depth about the so-called negative ones and the key characteristics they have of being disturbing. Check the last time you were depressed and jealous. It's not fun. And they are disturbing, but the really key one, and this is, you know, goes into great depth, is how they're distorted. They're conceptual stories deep down that are liars, are misconceptions, are delusional, are distorted. And so that's why when we're really extremely angry, we call it paranoid, you know. You're out of your brain. You lost the plot. We know this. So Buddhist psychology deals with this in a really fascinating way. They're distorted, disturbing, neurotic, delusional states of mind. And then the positive ones are reasonable and peaceful and harmonious and appropriate. And there's this very big distinction between them. So now getting to your question, if you looked at the contents of Buddhist psychology, you know, and there's thousands of states of mind, but when you study the text, the key ones, you won't find one called grief. So I think it's a term we've come up with. That's perfectly fine, you know, but I think it's got several components. And so one of them obviously would be, you'd say it's empathy. You've got this connection with this wonderful person, you had a good life together, and now they've gone and died on you. Or indeed they left you for a younger version. The grief is the same, in a sense, isn't it? So, but the key point for the Buddha is why there's suffering in the person. And then again, don't hear this as blame. It's because of the neurotic states of mind. And the key one there is attachment. Now this word, we could spend the rest of the weekend just on this word. It's massive in Buddhist psychology. And to really understand Buddhist psychology, you've got to get what Buddha means by this. It's not the way we use the word at all. So attachment's this almost effectively, under the heading negative, it's effectively the main source of all our suffering in day-to-day life from the Buddhist psychological model point of view. So there's so attachment is this really deeply ingrained, instinctive, at the most primordial level. It's almost at the level of an energetic level. Its energy is a feeling of incredible dissatisfaction, a feeling of being cut off, lonely, bereft, never having enough, never being enough, always dissatisfied. Now, I think every one of us recognizes that, you know. That's the energy of attachment. Then the next level of this attachment is like a hankering, a craving, a neediness for something that we're convinced is missing. That's what dissatisfaction is. And then on the basis of that, the most obvious level of attachment is the object of the senses. So you start looking for the delicious cakes or the handsome bodies or the nice music, which naturally then the attachment will then go to, and then this is the killer of attachment. The energy of attachment in us will then make, when I'm in love with David, when I'm looking for a nice guy to fill up the gaping hole, then David will look divine to me. When I'm attached to David, he'll look really delicious. We know this. So this attachment energy, putting it in a really raw way, it's real energy. It's like a junkie, basically, but it's so subtle and so primordial, and it underpins all the other stuff, and it pollutes our good stuff. So this attachment then, here, it's really, the essence of attachment would be to say it's this constant craving every second, frantic, fear-based, every second to get what I want. It feels kind of depressing, kind of ego-based, totally ego-based. But another way to put it is, every second, attachment is a craving to only get the nice things. So the Buddhist view would be, when we really go into great depth into our mind, the way that he's talking, we're going to see that this is what is like a motor that drives us. And it even, it impels even our good decisions, our virtues. So right now I will say, I have love for David. Now love's under the positive heading. Love is altruistic. Love is may David be happy. It's a delight. When I see him happy, I'm happy he's happy. Compassion is may he not suffer. When I see him suffering, I have empathy. These are virtuous states of mind. But right now, I can't see the difference. My attachment to get what I want completely pollutes my love. In fact, the only reason I want David to be happy is because he's doing what my attachment wants. Isn't it? You understand my point? So as soon as he, farts under the sheets instead of the toilet, doesn't look at me the nice way every day, dares to look at somebody else or not come home on time, and I'm not being, silly here, then of course my attachment has a panic attack. You see my point? I get upset, I get jealous, because jealousy, anger are the responses to thwarted attachment. And this is really quite subtle, the way it works. So in the case of a person whose beloved died, or your baby died, and don't hear this as religious or punitive. We should be crying with compassion for ourselves, hearing this stuff, Then our grief is got a massive component of, because attachment's been thwarted. Either your beloved left you for a younger version, or they died. I mean, the grief is beyond bearing. And why it never heals is because of the attachment. And because it becomes incredibly depressed, hopeless, life is a disaster, life is not worthwhile. We completely only see the bad. And no wonder you want to go kill yourself, because you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. This is because of attachment and aversion, these states of mind. And that's why it's so heavy for us to hear this, because it sounds, when we talk like this, it's like a sin, like you're a bad person. Do you understand what I'm saying? But that's very much a component of grief. And when we heal from it, and that's why people feel bad giving up grief, because they think they're cheating on their beloved. We think almost it's not good to feel happy again. We've got to keep being sad and miserable. You almost feel guilty for being happy again. Do you understand? Yeah, that's very much what happens while we stay stuck in the misery, because we almost think it's virtuous to be depressed and miserable. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's quite nuanced, so there's more to it than that.
There's a famous story that Hemingway...
Can't quite hear you.
There's a famous story that Hemingway wrote in one of his books, Islands of the Stream, where a guy... his son is killed in the war, and he finds out that he gets a letter that your son has been killed in the war, and then he goes to a party and he starts dancing, and people say, how can you dance on the day your son died? And he said, well, I knew I had to get over it sooner or later. I just chose sooner.
Oh, okay. Maybe he's a very brave person. He's either couldn't care, or he's really advanced practitioner, I would say. Yeah, but it's a very nice story though. Anyway, any other questions? Any other questions? Yes.
That cup that you were talking about.
Would you say that again?
The cup?
Cup, yes.
Pretty cup.
Yes.
So the word pretty, we're put because your feeling arises, right?
Huh?
You look at the object,
yeah,
and you feel energy, and it's
that's right.
Energy.
That's right.
And you call it always beautiful.
That's right.
But in this cup will hurt me or cut me, I'll hate it. So
that's right.
So it's a fantasy.
That's right.
I'm making up.
So you're agreeing with Buddha. Good. How what?
How can I trust to see things in the way they are?
Well, that's the point. That's where, see, I think in modern psychology, we would definitely not think we've got that ability. I think we have real doubt about the ability of the mind to be truthful, to really see facts. That's why we think very much about science, and even philosophy has to be objective, But that's the Buddha's point. That is the Buddha's point. The Buddha's point about the mind is it does have the capacity to see reality as it is, to see, that's what he's on about. It doesn't mean it's an easy job, it's an intensely difficult job, but that's exactly what Buddhist practice is. And the whole point is the mind has this potential. That's Buddha's finding. And that's what Buddhism is. That's what the practice is. Does that answer your question, though, just in theory?
No, I think it's, continue practicing meditation and learning more about it. So
that's right, well, exactly. But, it's like, it's important to get the theoretical point that Buddha's making, isn't it? To hear what he says is possible. That's what he's saying. He has found from his own experience that these neuroses that are the ones that lie to us, aren't at the core of our being. So there's a lot of teachings and discussions in Buddhist psychology about the mind in this way, which is really fascinating, just to know about theoretically, that mind in its nature has the potential to be utterly clear and pure and virtuous. That's the Buddha's whole point. So it's a fascinating idea because it's not how we think in our culture. Absolutely not at all. So it's interesting.
It's hard because you're not experiencing that.
Precisely, that's right.
So
Exactly.
Logically it makes sense.
Yes.
You can see certain bits and bytes in life. And
Yeah, that's right.
It's harder to see because our daily life is not oriented.
Because what?
The daily routines, daily life
Yes.
is not. I don't think about it.
That's right, exactly.
So,
but I suppose if we were going to be practicing, we would be applying it every second. That's what we'd be learning to do that, wouldn't we? If we were applying these tools. Yeah. But I think the starting point is a good one to know theoretically that's possible. I know for myself, when I got interested in Buddhism, I found that very powerful. Buddha's view that the potential of the mind is so marvelous. That gives me courage. It's sort of a bit like you've got water that's really polluted and you just assume pollution is a natural part of the water, and one day you meet a scientist who says no, pollution can be removed. It's quite a revelation. And initially you don't know it, but it's an encouraging point to hear that it's possible that you can depollute your mind of all the rubbish and all the suffering. It's pretty intense. You see my point?
You can see only through the meditation.
Sorry, darling?
You can only see inside through the meditation.
Are you asking that as a question?
Yes.
Well, it's for me, I'd rather not use the word meditation because we have so many concepts about it that might not let us hear it clearly. But yes, the Buddhist view is because thoughts are internal, and we only hear the grossest tip of the iceberg in day-to-day life, obviously, because we're mostly involved in the external world. From the second we wake up in the morning until the second we go to sleep, we know. We can hear the thoughts all raging on. It's like this constant stream of thoughts. We know it. But we tend to assume, well, you just deal with life, you know. But the Buddhist approach, necessarily, of course, it's an internal job. Absolutely internal. And that's why to do this job really well of unpacking and unraveling all these conceptual stories that go to really subtle level, you've got to have this concentration, that accomplished from doing this technique. The levels of concentration that go to incredibly subtle degrees. The more we get that concentration, the more we apply that, the subtler the mind becomes, the more capable to unpack and unravel our thoughts. Absolutely. That's right. It's a practical skill. That's right. Exactly. And to do the job long term, there's no question. You've got to have this single pointedness. There's no doubt. But we all start where we are, though. We can do we can learn to become more introspective without being all cosmic. You can learn to, like even when you start to the day with few minutes of just sitting there and just sitting there, a few minutes of just focus. For that few minutes, what you're doing is practicing the skill to just not be caught up blindly in what's going on here unconsciously. So then what happens normally, you're driving, you get up in the morning, you get your breakfast, do this, do that, fix your hair, we're on autopilot, right? We know there's stuff going on in there, but we're not paying attention. And then you're in the car and the guy jumps in front of you and you freak out. So when you start to develop even a semblance of awareness, and I don't hear it as religious, of practical introspection, you're also noticing the car and the cars, but you're noticing your thoughts. So as we get better and better at this, we're noticing the thoughts deeper, and so then we catch them before they explode out the mouth. That's the skill that we learn to develop. That's the point. We get better and better at that. So it's like any skill, you learn it, But it's intensely hard because when he's home late and I'm raging on in my jealous panic, it's very hard to be introspective then because you're just buying into that story 100% and I'm right and he's wrong. And he comes in the door and you blast at him, Do you understand? So to be able to have enough introspection, enough courage and practice and do all the talking in my own mind before he walks in the door, and then, hi darling, how are you? And then he'll explain that the car broke down and his mobile broke. And oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. Then you've solved the problem inside. And then if he did cheat on you, then you can handle it as well. But when it's just emotion and we're not aware, it all comes out and then it's so much harder to get past it. So this is an intensely hard job, but this is the point. It's practical. And the point I like to make also is Buddha, because he's not a creator, he doesn't own this stuff. He didn't make all this stuff up. He's observed it. Anyone can observe it too, he's saying. You understand? That's why all these words, I'm saying all this stuff, which is pure, I'm talking pure Buddhist psychology here. But we can hear these words are quite familiar. You know, they don't sound Indian or Tibetan, they sound like ordinary world, you know. Do you see my point? We all know this stuff. Just, I would suggest that Buddha's expertise is his methods for dealing with this stuff. I just find it marvellous, actually. You understand?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In the newspapers, one reads regularly articles about happiness.
Yes.
And there they say that one of the components of happiness is the relationships with other
yes,
people.
absolutely. Yes.
Last year there was a documentary about life in Sweden where it says that almost half of the households are people living alone.
Yes.
So it has epidemic proportions.
Yes, I understand.
And different philosophies offer
Yes.
different views of,
Yes.
of loneliness, because we are born alone, we die
Yes.
alone.
Yes.
So my question is your
Yes.
thoughts.
Thank you very much, yeah. That's a really interesting point. The Buddha's, you know, the Buddhist understanding of happiness. Okay, what we think of happiness now, and it's true, what your point is really powerful, and this is our materialist view of that we're essentially social beings, that we define ourselves in terms of good social relationships, starting with mummy and daddy and siblings and aunties and uncles. It's true, and we can see there's a truth in that, you know. So then, because of that truth, that we define ourselves socially, when you haven't got the partner, or if you live alone, then naturally you're lonely and depressed, because it goes against that model that we've got. Now, the Buddhist view is quite different. In one sense, it's exactly the same. You can be a person brought up with a lovely mummy, lovely daddy, and be, you know, and learn love and kindness, and you'd be a marvelous human being. But the Buddhist point is this: happiness. Okay, we think now what happiness is what we get. Buddha's view, it's what we get when we have nice people, nice things, nice sounds, nice taste, nice praise, happy job, sunny weather. In other words, we define it in terms of the external, which is including human beings. This is a default mode for us. And I think that is our philosophy. We assume that happiness literally comes from pleasant external environment. Do you understand my point? Now, Buddha, again, wouldn't argue with that, but the way Buddhism would say it, if you like, that the external environment, nice mummy, daddy, David, and weather and food, they are a component in my happiness, but they're only a catalyst. They're only a catalyst. They're a secondary cause of my happiness. The main cause of my happiness is my mind, the extent to which it isn't attached, isn't anxious, isn't jealous, isn't depressed. That's what happiness is. So for the Buddha, taking this attachment energy and then anger and jealousy which come because of it, it's the extent to which I'm free of those extent to which I'm happy. And the bonus is having friends in my family. So if you've worked on your mind, the Buddhist view, you'd be happy on your own and you'd be happy with people. You'd get the best of both worlds. Because happiness doesn't only come from the outside. So it's a fine point, but it's a crucial point. So it's internal. So, you know, do you hear the point? Literally. So again, summarizing really, the extent we say happiness is, when putting it in Buddhist terms, this attachment energy is this massive one, this craving, always wanting the nice things. And when we get the nice things, that's what we call happiness. Okay? So when he's always nice to me, always generous, always loving, always saying sweet words. Do you understand? So our usual view is happiness is what we get when attachment gets what it wants. The Buddha says happiness is what we get when we give up attachment, and therefore anger and jealousy. So it's an internal one. Clearly, this is the essential point the Buddha's making. And I think we can prove it every day. You know, if I'm really miserable, really depressed, really low self-esteem, no matter how much he loves me, it'll never be enough. We know people like this all the time. Do you understand my point? You can tick all the boxes: money in the bank, job, husband, children, and I'm still depressed. And this is, everyone in this room can say we're like that. And this is proving Buddha's point, that it's not enough just to have money and mummy and daddy and husbands. And it's not being religious, it's practical. If my mind is miserable, if I'm depressed and never satisfied, no matter how much he loves me, it'll be like water off a duck's back. We know this is true. We see it every day. You see my point? So it's proving Buddha's point, that if you don't work on the internal, no matter how much money or beloveds you have, you'll still be miserable. And you can equally, my friends in prison, I can tell you the ones I know. My friend on death row in Kentucky, Mitch, been there 30 years. He was with one of the other guys, Leif. He's a Leif Halverson. He's not from Sweden. Where's that from? Where's Leif? What's that name from? Norway, maybe Norway. He's American, but he's a Catholic. They've both been there 30 years on death row. They were sort of doing some drug dealing. You have guns in America, don't you? When you have guns, guess what? People die, you know. They're not psychos. They're just guys who had guns. And so unfortunately 3 people died. They're on death row. All their appeals are finished because you stay like 30 years on the appeals, you know. So they're both, I've known them for 20 years, 20 plus. Lovely human beings. And so Mitch, he says, Robina, I'm ready for that electric jolt, you know. And he says he meditates every day on compassion for the man who will kill him when he gets killed. It won't be long before he'll get killed. And so all I'm saying is a guy who was in the wrong place, the wrong time, with guns and drugs, killed 3 people, completely marvellous human being. He's become a Buddhist, leaves it like a Catholic, really lovely human beings who are dealing with garbage dump, who are dealing with problems, but are happy human beings. Mitch is amazing. People love him on death row. It's like this family, 40 people, you know, on death row.